You won't believe what the sheriff found when he finally tracked down the man they called the Gentleman to his camp in the breaks of the Cimarron River in the autumn of 1884. He had been hunting him for 11 months. 11 months of cold trails and false sightings and the specific exhausting frustration of tracking a man who seemed to understand pursuit the way a predator understands prey, not by running from it, but by letting it come close enough to study and then stepping sideways into the dark and waiting for it to pass. The camp was empty when the sheriff arrived. The fire was cold. The bedroll was gone. But something had been left behind. Something that the sheriff described in his report to the territorial marshal as evidence of an appetite that went beyond anything the wanted poster had prepared him for. Something that made 11 months of pursuit feel suddenly and completely insufficient. Tonight, Pale Meridian brings you 3 true outlaw horror stories from the frontier, not the romanticized outlaws of dime novels and campfire mythology. The real ones, the ones whose true accounts were quietly buried by the people who encountered them, because the truth was darker and stranger than anything the legend could hold. A man who rode the Cimarron country in the 1880s, whose crimes went far beyond robbery, and whose camp told a story that the sheriff who found it never fully described in any public record. The true account of a gang that operated along the Natchez Trace in the final years of the frontier, whose methods were so specific and so deliberate that the investigators who studied them concluded they could not have been the work of ordinary men, motivated by ordinary greed. And a bounty hunter who tracked a wanted killer into the Llano Estacado, the staked plains of West Texas, and found him. And found something else beside him that the bounty hunter spent the rest of his life trying to explain to people who were not there and who could not quite bring themselves to believe him. This is Pale Meridian, where the frontier ends and the darkness begins. Ride with us. Story 1. The Gentleman of the Cimarron. They called him the Gentleman because of the way he dressed, not the clothing of a working cowhand or a frontier laborer, the specific careful dress of someone who understood that appearance was its own kind of weapon. A dark coat kept clean against the dust of the territory. A hat brushed and shaped with attention. Boots that had been expensive once and were maintained with the specific care of someone for whom detail was not vanity, but strategy. He was first reported in the Cimarron country of the Indian Territory in the spring of 1883. A stagecoach robbery, 3 passengers relieved of their valuables. The driver told to sit still and be grateful he was being allowed to continue his journey. Polite, by the driver's account. Almost formal. The kind of robber who thanks you for your cooperation and means it in a way that makes the thanks more frightening than the gun. The second robbery was different. Same territory 6 weeks later, a merchant traveling alone with a mule loaded with trade goods. The merchant was found 3 days after he was reported overdue on the bank of the Cimarron River, alive but in a condition that the deputy who found him described in his report as one of profound and specific distress that went beyond the physical effects of robbery and exposure. The merchant would say only that the gentleman had asked him questions, long and patient and specific questions about the merchant's life, his family, his history, his fears, delivered with the same formal courtesy of the stagecoach robbery, while the mule stood quietly nearby and the river moved past them in the dark. He would not describe the questions in specific detail. He would not say what answers he had given. He sold his business within the month and moved east and was not heard from again in the territory. The sheriff who was assigned the case was a man named Caleb Marsh, former cavalry, methodical, not given to the kind of frontier superstition that colored the accounts of less experienced lawmen. He read the reports carefully and identified what he believed was a pattern in the gentleman's movements, a circuit of the Cimarron country that repeated on a roughly 6-week cycle, hitting isolated travelers in remote homesteads with the specific regularity of someone who had mapped their territory with care and worked it systematically. He set up to intercept the circuit. It took 4 attempts over 8 months before Marsh got ahead of the pattern instead of behind it. On the 5th attempt, he found the camp in the breaks of the Cimarron, a sheltered hollow in the rough country above the river, concealed from 3 sides by the broken terrain, and accessible from the 4th only by a trail that showed the specific wear of regular use over an extended period. The fire was cold, 2 days old at least, Marsh estimated from the ash. The bedroll was gone. The camp had been struck with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times in many places and had learned to leave nothing behind. Almost nothing. What Marsh found at the edge of the camp, in the specific location that a man sitting at a fire would have to his right hand, close enough to reach without rising, was a collection of objects arranged with a deliberateness that he described in his report as not consistent with items dropped or forgotten, but with items placed. I am going to tell you what the objects were because they are recorded in the Territorial Marshal's case file, and because I think their specific nature matters to understanding what the gentleman was doing in that camp on those 6-week circuits through the Cimarron country. 13 small objects, each one personal in the specific way of something that belonged to a specific individual. A woman's ring, a child's button, a man's pocket watch stopped at the same time, a length of ribbon, a lock of hair tied with twine, a photograph worn soft at the edges from handling. Each one different, each one the kind of object that a person carries because it connects them to someone or something that matters to them. 13 of them, arranged in a careful line, as if they had been taken out and looked at regularly and returned to their arrangement with the specific attention of someone performing a private ritual in the firelight of a camp in the breaks of the Cimarron River. Marsh sent a description of each object to every law enforcement office in the territory and the surrounding states. 3 of the 13 were identified as belonging to people who had been reported missing in the Cimarron country in the 18 months before Marsh found the camp. Not robbery victims who had been found afterward, missing persons who had never been found at all. 3 of 13 identified, 10 unidentified. The gentleman was never caught. He was reported twice more in the Cimarron country in the following year, and then the sighting stopped and the report stopped, and he passed into the specific silence of frontier history that swallows the people who do not want to be remembered. Marsh kept the case file open until he retired 14 years later. He added to it periodically as new information came in or old information was recontextualized by new findings. The last entry in the file is dated 1897 and consists of a single sentence in Marsh's handwriting. It says, 13 objects, likely 13 people. The ones we identified were the ones he wanted us to find. The others he kept for himself. What do you think the gentleman asked those people in the dark by the river? And what do you think he did with the answers? The frontier produced men who used its vastness as cover for things that civilization would not have permitted them. The next story proves that sometimes the most dangerous outlaws were not the ones with the highest bounties on their heads. They were the ones nobody had thought to put a price on yet. Story 2. The Natchez Trace Company. The Natchez Trace, in its final years as a working frontier road, was one of the most dangerous routes in the American West. I want to establish that before I tell you about the company that operated along it in the late 1870s, because I think the baseline danger matters to how you understand what made this particular group distinctive. The Trace was known for outlaws. Travelers expected risk. The law along that route was thin and inconsistent, and the people who rode it had generally made their peace with the possibility that they might not reach their destination. What they had not made their peace with, what the investigators who eventually studied the Trace killings concluded no traveler could have reasonably anticipated, was what the company was doing and why. They called themselves a company in the formal sense, a group of men operating together with a division of labor and a chain of authority that suggested organization rather than opportunism. Most frontier outlaw gangs operated on impulse and opportunity. The Natchez Trace Company operated on a schedule. This was the first thing the investigator assigned to the case, a former Pinkerton detective named Howard Gill, identified as unusual when he began studying the pattern of incidents along the Trace in 1878. Not the incidents themselves, which individually resembled ordinary robbery and violence, but the timing of them. The specific regularity of the intervals between incidents, the consistency of the gap between one event and the next that suggested not random opportunism, but planned rotation. The second thing Gill identified was the selection. Most robbery gangs targeted the wealthiest-looking travelers, the ones most likely to be carrying significant money or valuables. The Natchez Trace Company showed no consistent preference for wealthy targets. Their victims came from every economic category that traveled the road: merchants and laborers, traveling families and solo riders, people with obvious means and people with almost none. What the victims had in common was not wealth. It took Gill 3 months of case analysis to identify what it actually was. They were all traveling alone. Every single incident along the trace that Gill attributed to the company involved a solo traveler. Not one incident involved a group of 2 or more. The company was selecting specifically for isolation, for the specific vulnerability of a single person on a long, empty road with nobody ahead of them who would notice if they stopped arriving and nobody behind them who had seen them go. The third thing Gill identified was the most disturbing and the one he was most reluctant to commit to his official report because he understood what it implied and what it said about the nature of what was happening on the Natchez Trace. The company was not primarily motivated by robbery. The money and valuables taken from victims were real and were presumably used to fund the company's continued operation. But the pattern of what was taken and what was left behind did not match the pattern of a robbery gang for whom theft was the primary purpose. Valuables were sometimes taken selectively, specific items chosen and others left, in ways that suggested the choice was not based on monetary value, but on something else that Gill could not identify with certainty from the evidence available to him. And in several of the cases where victims had survived their encounter with the company, 4 survivors in the period Gill studied, all of whom had been left for dead and recovered, the accounts of what had happened described an experience that went beyond robbery, in ways that the survivors struggled to articulate and that Gill recorded carefully in his case notes, despite being uncertain what to do with the information. All 4 survivors described the same thing independently and without knowledge of each other's accounts. They described being asked to talk, not interrogated in the manner of someone seeking information about valuables or security arrangements, asked to talk about themselves, their lives, their origins, their families, their histories, their fears and their hopes, and the specific texture of their inner lives in ways that suggested the company was interested in something that could not be taken from a saddlebag or a money belt. One survivor, a woman traveling to meet her husband who was establishing a homestead further west, described her encounter with the company as lasting several hours. She described the man who spoke to her as genuinely attentive in a way she found more frightening than hostility would have been. She said he listened the way a person listens when they intend to remember. She said he was collecting something. I do not know what to call it, but he was collecting it from me, the same way you collect an object, with care and with intention, and when he had enough of it, he stood up and thanked me and left me there. And I lay in the road until morning, and I have never been able to describe what I felt was missing from me when I got up. Howard Gill's investigation was concluded without arrests or identifications in 1881. The company appears to have ceased operations on the Natchez Trace around that time, whether because they moved their operation elsewhere or because they had accomplished whatever it was they set out to accomplish. Gill could not determine. His final report to his clients runs to 47 pages and concludes with a paragraph that his employers apparently found so unsatisfactory that they requested he remove it before the report was filed. He refused. The paragraph remains in the original document, which is held in a private archive and which I have read in full. It says, I cannot identify with certainty what this company was taking from its victims beyond the physical valuables documented in each case, but I am satisfied that the physical valuables were incidental to their primary purpose, and that their primary purpose was something I do not have adequate professional vocabulary to describe. I am also satisfied that whatever they were collecting it deliberately, and that they knew what it was, even if I do not. I recommend that this case remain open indefinitely. The case was closed the following year. What do you think the Natchez Trace Company was collecting? And do you think they found enough of it on that road? Some outlaws took money, some took lives. The ones in the next story took something that the bounty hunter who found them could never name and never forget, and never fully convince anyone else was real. Story 3. The Llano. I'm going to tell you about a bounty hunter named Cross. Just Cross. I have never found a first name in any of the documents, and the man himself apparently never offered one in any of the interviews he gave in the years after what happened on the Llano Estacado in the winter of 1886. He was known in the Texas Panhandle country as a reliable and experienced tracker, a man who had brought in 14 wanted individuals in 6 years without losing one, and without being accused of unnecessary violence in the taking of any of them. A professional in the specific unglamorous sense of someone who did a dangerous job competently and consistently and without drama. He took the job tracking a man named Elias Cord in November of 1886. Cord was wanted for 3 killings along the Canadian River, straightforward frontier violence, disputes over cattle and water rights that had escalated to murder in the specific way of frontier disputes that had no court to resolve them. The reward was substantial. The warrant was clear. The job was the kind Cross had done 14 times before. The Llano Estacado is the high plains of West Texas and eastern New Mexico, a vast elevated tableland that the Spanish named the Staked Plains, because early explorers drove stakes into the ground to find their way back across it, the landscape being so flat and so featureless that without markers, a man could walk in circles until he died and never know he was doing it. In the winter of 1886, it was one of the most isolated places in the continental United States. No towns, no water sources that a man unfamiliar with the country could find without guidance. Just flat grass and cold sky in every direction to the horizon, and beyond the horizon, more of the same. Cross tracked Cord onto the Llano in late November, following a trail that he described as surprisingly easy to follow for a man who presumably wanted to disappear, as if Cord was not hiding but traveling with a specific destination in mind and was not concerned about being followed because he expected to reach that destination before pursuit caught up with him. Cross caught up with him on the 5th day. He found Cord's camp in a shallow depression in the plains, the only feature in miles of flat ground, a natural hollow that would have been invisible until you were almost in it. Cord was there, alive, sitting cross-legged at a dead fire with his hands on his knees and his eyes open, facing north. Cross approached with his weapon drawn and identified himself and told Cord he was under arrest. Cord did not respond, did not move, did not appear to register Cross's presence in any way that Cross could identify as conscious awareness. He was breathing. Cross confirmed this, but the specific quality of his stillness was not the stillness of sleep or unconsciousness. It was the stillness of a man who was present somewhere else entirely, and whose body had been left behind in a hollow on the Llano Estacado, facing north with his hands on his knees. Cross searched the camp while keeping Cord in his sightline. The camp was sparse. Bedroll, provisions, a rifle, the ordinary equipment of a man traveling hard across difficult country. But at the northern edge of the hollow, at the point that Cord was facing from his position at the dead fire, Cross found something that he has described in every subsequent account with a consistency that suggests he was not embellishing or misremembering, but was attempting with genuine effort to convey something accurately that resisted accurate conveyance. A space in the grass where the ground was bare, circular, perhaps 8 feet across. The grass at the edges of the circle was not cut or burned but bent, pressed outward from the center in a pattern that suggested something had rested in that space, and the grass had conformed to its presence and remained conformed after it had gone. The bare earth in the center of the circle was not frozen the way the surrounding ground was frozen in November on the Llano Estacado. It was warm. Cross pressed his hand to it and held it there for a long moment and confirmed that the ground in the circle was warm in a way that the ambient temperature and the dead fire and the absence of any heat source he could identify could not account for. He got Cord onto his horse with difficulty. The man was ambulatory when physically directed, but showed no independent volition, moving when moved and stopping when the direction stopped, like a mechanism whose operator had stepped away from the controls. Cross tied him to the saddle and rode south off the Llano and did not stop until he reached the first settlement he could find, which was a small ranch house occupied by a family who took one look at Cord and at Cross and put them both inside by the fire without asking questions. Cord remained in the condition Cross had found him in for 3 days. On the 4th day, he became agitated and then lucid, and then he looked at Cross across the ranch house table and said, "You shouldn't have brought me back from there." Cross asked him where there was. Cord looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what to call it, but they let me see it. And now I know what's out there past the edge of everything. And knowing it is not something you can put down once you pick it up." He would not say anything else about it. He was transported to the county seat and tried for the 3 Canadian river killings and convicted and sentenced, and he served his sentence and was released in 1893 and was not heard from again. Cross gave his account publicly for the first time in 1891 at a gathering of frontier lawmen in Amarillo, where he had been asked to speak about tracking methods. He described what he had found on the Llano and what Cord had said at the ranch house table. The room was quiet when he finished, and nobody asked follow-up questions, and the account was not included in the published summary of the gathering's proceedings. He gave the account several more times in the following years to various audiences who received it with the specific polite skepticism of people who have decided in advance that what they are hearing cannot be true and are waiting for the speaker to finish so they can move on to something more manageable. He died in 1903. His obituary in the Amarillo paper described him as a reliable and experienced tracker who had brought in 15 wanted individuals in his career without losing one. It did not mention the Llano. It did not mention the circle in the grass or the warm earth in November, or a man sitting at a dead fire facing north with his hands on his knees, looking at something that Cross could not see. It did not mention what Cord said at the ranch house table about knowing what is out there past the edge of everything and not being able to put it down once you pick it up. Some things the frontier produced it kept to itself, and some of the men who encountered those things decided that keeping them to themselves was the only reasonable response to the discovery that the world was larger and stranger and more inhabited than they had been told. Cross kept it to himself for years. Then he told it to anyone who would listen. Then he died, and the obituary did not mention it, and the Llano kept its secret the way it had always kept its secret, not by hiding it, but by being so vast and so empty and so indifferent to human presence that the things that happened in it simply had nowhere to be reported to. What do you think Elias Cord saw out there on the Llano Estacado? And what do you think is still out there now in that warm circle in the grass when the temperature drops in November and the plains stretch flat to every horizon and there is nobody for 100 miles in any direction to see it? Welcome back to Pale Meridian, 3 outlaw horror stories from the frontier that the dime novels never told. The Gentleman of the Cimarron, with his 13 objects arranged in a careful line beside the cold fire, 3 of them identified as belonging to people who were never found. The Natchez Trace Company and the thing they were collecting from solo travelers on a long, empty road that a survivor described as something she could feel was missing from her when she stood up in the morning. And Cross and Cord and a circle of warm earth on the Llano Estacado in November, and the specific knowledge that Cord carried out of that hollow and could not put down and would not describe. The frontier was not the place the legends suggest. The men who wrote it were not the men the dime novels described, and the things that happened in those 3 million square miles of territory that the law had not yet reached were not the things that got written into the history books. They were written in territorial marshal case files and Pinkerton detective reports and the unpublished paragraphs that employers requested be removed before filing. They were written in the specific silence of men like Cross, who told their story to anyone who would listen and died with their obituary mentioning 15 bounties and not mentioning the Llano. This is Pale Meridian, where the frontier ends and the darkness begins. Ride with us. New frontier horror stories every week. Subscribe and join us in the dark. And if your family rode the frontier, If your grandfather's grandfather tracked men across the Llano, or rode the Natchez Trace, or passed through the Cimarron country and left behind a story that your family has always told quietly and never quite explained, leave it below. We want to hear it. Good night. And watch the horizon, because something out there is watching back.